Dust choked the air of Oakhaven as the mob howled for blood. A woman, battered and bound, was dragged through the merciless streets for sins she never committed. But before the final stone could be cast, a towering shadow blocked the sun, and a voice like thunder rumbled, "Enough!" The autumn wind sweeping through the Colorado Territory carried a bitter chill, but it was nothing compared to the coldness in the eyes of the citizens of Oakhaven. It was the year of our Lord, 1883, and the frontier town, a place that prided itself on its newfound civilization and brick-laid bank, had stripped away its veneer of decency to reveal the feral beasts underneath. Down the center of Main Street, a path usually reserved for freight wagons and stagecoaches, Abigail Prescott was being dragged through the mud. Her wrists were bound tight with coarse, fraying hemp rope, the other end of which was wrapped casually around the saddle horn of Deputy Caleb Tucker's roan gelding. Tucker kept the horse at a slow, agonizing walk, just fast enough that Abigail had to stumble, trip, and scramble to keep from being pulled face first into the horse manure and jagged rocks that littered the thoroughfare. Her knees were torn. The fabric of her once pristine gingham dress, stained with a sickening mixture of dark earth and bright crimson. "Whore! Thief!" spat Clara Higgins, the town's premier seamstress and chief gossiper, as she hurled a rotten apple that struck Abigail square in the shoulder. Abigail gasped, her breath hitching in her throat, but she refused to cry out. Her auburn hair, usually pinned in a neat, respectable bun, hung in tangled, sweat-soaked sheets across her bruised face. She lifted her chin, her green eyes blazing with a defiant fire that terrified the townsfolk just enough to make them hate her even more. She had not committed the sins they condemned her for. She knew it, and deep down in the black, festering heart of Oakhaven, Mayor Thaddeus Cornwall knew it too. Cornwall stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the assayer's office, a gold-tipped cane resting in his manicured hands. He was a man of immense wealth and insatiable appetites, a man who believed that everything in Oakhaven belonged to him. For the past 6 months, he had decided that Abigail Prescott should belong to him too. She was the daughter of a humble, deceased blacksmith, left with nothing but her father's debts and a small cabin on the edge of the timberline. When Cornwall had offered to wipe the slate clean in exchange for her becoming his private mistress, Abigail had spat on his polished leather boots. A man like Thaddeus Cornwall did not take rejection. He took revenge. 2 days prior, the Oakhaven Bank was robbed in the dead of night. $2,000 in gold eagles vanished from the vault. There were no broken locks, no shattered glass, only a single, damning piece of evidence left behind. A handkerchief embroidered with the initials A.P. The trial had been a farce. The town's judge owed Cornwall money. The jury was composed of Cornwall's ranch hands and business partners. Abigail wasn't allowed a lawyer. She was dragged from her bed, thrown into a cell, and condemned before the sun even rose. Cornwall hadn't just framed her for theft. He had paid the town drunks to testify that she was a woman of low morals, entertaining outlaws and bandits in her cabin to fund her wickedness. Oakhaven, a town drowning in its own puritanical hypocrisy, consumed the lies like starving dogs. "Look at her," a man yelled from the crowd. "Not so high and mighty now, are you, Miss Prescott?" Reverend Josiah Miller stood on the steps of his church, clutching a Bible to his chest. As Abigail was dragged past him, her bleeding knees scraping over a patch of exposed bedrock, she caught his eye. She had mended his vestments for free. She had baked pies for his ailing wife. The Reverend, pale and trembling, simply looked away, staring at the gray, overcast sky as if seeking salvation in the clouds. "Keep moving, Jezebel," Deputy Tucker sneered, giving the rope a sharp, vicious tug. Abigail lost her footing entirely. She crashed hard into the dirt, crying out as the breath was knocked from her lungs. The rough hemp burned into her wrists, stripping the skin away as the horse continued to step forward, dragging her limp body through the muck. The crowd erupted into a sickening cheer, a chorus of jeers and laughter that echoed off the wooden facades of the saloons and general stores. Cornwall stepped off the boardwalk, waving a hand to halt the deputy. He walked toward Abigail, his boots squelching softly in the mud. He crouched down, uncaring that the hem of his expensive wool trousers touched the dirt, and grabbed Abigail roughly by the jaw, forcing her to look at him. "It doesn't have to be this way, Abigail," Cornwall whispered, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the roaring crowd. "Confess to the theft. Tell them I have graciously offered to take you in and reform you. Say the word, and you will sleep in a featherbed tonight." Abigail tasted copper in her mouth. She glared into Cornwall's cold, dead eyes, gathered the blood and saliva pooling on her tongue, and spat directly into his face. Cornwall recoiled with a snarl, wiping his cheek with a silk handkerchief. He stood up, his face flushed with murderous rage. "Drag her to the edge of town, deputy!" Cornwall roared. "Let her walk into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back. Let the wolves have her." The crowd roared their approval. Deputy Tucker grinned, spurring his horse to a trot. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the agony of being pulled across the jagged terrain, preparing her soul for the end. But the agony didn't come. Instead, the frantic, panicked whinny of Tucker's horse pierced the air, followed by a heavy, breathless silence that fell over the town like a suffocating blanket. Jedediah Callahan did not care for the affairs of civilized men. For the better part of a decade, he had lived high in the unforgiving peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a solitary giant among the pines and the snowdrifts. He came down to the valleys only twice a year to trade pelts for coffee, flour, ammunition, and salt. To the townspeople, he was a myth wrapped in bear hide, a towering, bearded savage they simply called the Mountain Man. Jedediah stood 6'5", with shoulders as broad as a barn door and a face weathered by sun, wind, and old violence. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and his gray eyes held the piercing, uncompromising stare of a hawk. He wore buckskin trousers, a heavy coat made from a grizzly he had killed with a knife, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He rode a massive black draft horse named Goliath, leading a heavily burdened pack mule named Bessie. He had been riding for 3 days through the biting autumn chill, looking forward only to making his trades with the assayer and getting back to the silence of the high country before the first blizzard hit. As he turned Goliath onto Main Street, he heard the commotion. Jedediah halted his horse in the shadows between the blacksmith's forge and the livery stable. He sat completely still, his gray eyes scanning the chaotic scene unfolding down the street. He saw the mob. He saw the pompous man in the fine suit. He saw the deputy. And then, he saw the woman. She was covered in mud and blood, being dragged like a slaughtered deer behind a horse. Yet, what caught Jedediah's attention wasn't her suffering, but the sheer unbroken defiance in the way she held her head. She was a cornered animal, battered and bleeding, but her spirit remained unbroken. Jedediah had spent his life observing the wild. He recognized a predator, and he recognized prey. But this woman was neither. She was a survivor. He watched the man in the suit crouch down, whisper something, and recoil as she spat in his face. He heard the order to drag her to the wolves. Jedediah had left the world of men because he was tired of their cruelty. He had been a lawman once, in a life that felt like it belonged to a different century. He had walked away from the badge when he realized the law rarely had anything to do with justice. He had sworn an oath to the mountains that he would never again interfere in the bloody, petty squabbles of the towns below. But as Deputy Tucker spurred his horse forward, the rope pulling taut against the woman's bleeding wrists, the oath broke. With a subtle squeeze of his knees, Jedediah sent Goliath stepping out from the shadows. The massive draft horse, weighing nearly 2,000 pounds, moved with surprising silence until its iron-shod hooves struck the center of the muddy street. Jedediah rode Goliath directly into the path of Deputy Tucker. Tucker's roan gelding, suddenly confronted by a mountain of black muscle and bear hide, panicked. It reared up, tossing its head wildly. Tucker cursed, yanking on the reins to keep from being thrown into the mud, inadvertently giving Abigail a moment of slack. "Hey, are you blind, you giant freak?" Tucker shouted, his hand hovering over the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "Clear the street! This is official town business!" The crowd, previously roaring for blood, fell dead, silent. The sheer presence of the mountain man seemed to suck the air out of the street. Jedediah didn't say a word. He didn't look at the deputy. His gaze was fixed on the mud-covered woman kneeling in the dirt. He swung his massive leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. The heavy thud of his boots echoed in the quiet street. "I said back away, mountain man!" Tucker barked, pulling his revolver. The metallic click of the hammer cocking sounded incredibly loud in the tension-filled air. Jedediah ignored him. He walked with slow, deliberate steps toward Abigail. As he approached, he reached down to his thigh and drew a massive 10-inch Bowie knife from its leather sheath. The polished steel gleamed menacingly beneath the gray sky. Several women in the crowd gasped, covering their eyes. Thaddeus Cornwall took a cautious step backward, his cane trembling slightly in his grip. Jedediah knelt beside Abigail. She flinched, expecting the blade to plunge into her chest, but she didn't look away. Her green eyes met his gray ones. In that split second, a silent understanding passed between them. She saw no pity in his eyes, only a cold, hard resolution. With a swift, practiced motion, Jedediah slid the blade beneath the thick hemp rope binding her wrists and flicked his wrist upward. The coarse fibers snapped instantly. Abigail let out a shuddering breath as her arms fell to her sides, free. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" Cornwall suddenly bellowed, his shock finally giving way to outrage. "That woman is a convicted thief and a harlot. She is facing the justice of Oakhaven. You have no authority here, savage." Jedediah slowly stood up to his full, towering height. He didn't put the knife away. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the cowardly faces of the townsfolk, past the trembling deputy holding a gun, and finally resting on the red-faced mayor. "Enough," Jedediah rumbled. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated in the chests of everyone standing within 50 feet. It sounded like a rock slide waiting to happen, a warning from the earth itself. "You can't do this," Cornwall sputtered, though his voice cracked. "Tucker, shoot him! Shoot him where he stands for interfering with the law." Deputy Tucker's hands were shaking. He had his gun trained on Jedediah's broad chest. But looking at the man, Tucker had the sudden, terrifying realization that even if he put a bullet squarely in the mountain man's heart, the giant would still have enough time to rip Tucker's head off before he died. "Put the gun away, boy," Jedediah said, his voice deadly calm. "Unless you brought enough lead to finish the job." Tucker swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Cornwall, then back to the imposing figure in bear hide. Slowly, cowardly, he lowered the hammer and holstered the weapon. Cornwall was practically vibrating with rage. "You think you can just ride into my town and take her? Do you know who I am? I am Thaddeus Cornwall. I own this town, and I will see you hang from the tallest oak for this." Jedediah stared at Cornwall for a long moment. He took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between them. Cornwall tried to hold his ground, but the sheer physical mass and the scent of wood smoke, pine, and danger rolling off the mountain man forced him to take a step back. Jedediah leaned down, his face inches from the mayor's. "You don't own the mountains, Cornwall," Jedediah whispered, loud enough only for the mayor and Abigail to hear. "And if you ever send a man up my trail looking for her, I won't just kill him. I'll come back down here, and I'll burn your little empire to the ashes." Cornwall's face drained of all color. He looked into Jedediah's eyes and recognized a terrifying truth. This wasn't an idle threat. This was a promise, etched in stone. Furthermore, as Cornwall stared into those steely gray eyes, a flicker of forgotten recognition passed through his mind, a memory of a relentless, legendary lawman who had supposedly died in a fiery shootout in Abilene 10 years ago, a man they called the Bear. Cornwall swallowed nervously, his bravado entirely evaporating. Jedediah turned his back on the mayor, utterly dismissing him. He walked back to Abigail and extended a massive, calloused hand. Abigail looked at the hand, then up at the giant who had just defied an entire town for a woman he didn't even know. Her hands were bruised, bloody, and trembling, but she reached up and placed her hand in his. Jedediah pulled her to her feet with effortless strength. He guided her toward his pack mule, Bessie. He adjusted a canvas sack to make a soft seat, then hoisted Abigail up onto the mule's back as easily as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. He didn't bother to buy his supplies. He didn't care about the flour or the coffee anymore. He mounted Goliath, taking Bessie's lead rope in his hand. Without looking back at the stunned, silent crowd, Jedediah Callahan clicked his tongue, and the massive black horse began to walk out of Oakhaven, heading straight toward the looming, snow-capped peaks of the mountains. He had come to town for salt and ammunition. He was leaving with a fugitive, an enemy, and a war he hadn't intended to start. And as Abigail rode behind the mountain man, watching the corrupt, hateful town of Oakhaven shrink in the distance, she felt the first freezing drop of rain hit her cheek. A storm was coming, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the thunder. The ascent into the Sangre de Cristo Mountains was a brutal, bone-chilling ordeal. As Oakhaven disappeared beneath a blanket of gray fog, the promised autumn storm finally broke. Sleet hammered the narrow, treacherous trail, turning the packed dirt into a slick ribbon of ice. Abigail clung to the saddle horn of the pack mule, her teeth chattering so violently she thought her jaw might fracture. She was freezing, starving, and her wrists burned with a fiery agony where the rough hemp rope had torn away her skin. Yet, looking at the massive, unmoving silhouette of Jedediah Callahan riding ahead of her on his giant black horse, she felt an inexplicable sense of security. He absorbed the howling wind like a granite cliff, untouched and unbothered. They rode in total silence for 6 agonizing hours. The timberline swallowed them, replacing the barren foothills with towering, ancient ponderosa pines that groaned under the weight of the gathering snow. Abigail's vision began to blur. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the humiliation in the town square was rapidly fading, replaced by a numbing, dangerous exhaustion. She swayed dangerously in the saddle. Before she could slip and fall into the rocky ravine below, a massive, gloved hand caught her waist. Jedediah had stopped his horse. He looked down at her, his gray eyes assessing her pale, shivering form. Without a word, he dismounted, untied his heavy grizzly bear hide coat, and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. The coat dwarfed her, smelling heavily of wood smoke, pine needles, and leather, but the residual heat of his body was a blessing from heaven. "Drink," Jedediah commanded, his voice a low rumble over the wind. He offered her a leather canteen. Abigail took it with numb fingers, taking a grateful swallow. It was water mixed with a harsh, fiery whiskey that burned its way down to her stomach, instantly warming her core. She coughed, handing it back. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse. "We have 2 more miles," he said flatly, his gaze sweeping the darkening tree line. "Hold on. Do not fall asleep." By the time they reached Jedediah's cabin, night had completely fallen, and the sleet had turned into a blinding snowstorm. The cabin was a sturdy, low-slung structure built of thick, hand-hewn logs, tucked securely against the rock face of a sheltering cliff. Jedediah carried Abigail inside, laying her gently on a bed piled high with thick furs. He quickly built a roaring fire in the stone hearth, illuminating the sparse but meticulously clean interior. Traps, dried herbs, and cured meats hung from the rafters. A heavy Winchester rifle rested above the mantel. For the next 2 days, Abigail drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Jedediah tended to her with a surprisingly gentle touch for a man of his colossal size. He cleaned the infection from her torn wrists, applying a pungent, dark green poultice made from pine sap and yarrow that stung viciously but drew out the heat of the fever. He fed her rich, salty venison broth from a wooden spoon, never pressing her for answers, never demanding gratitude. On the 3rd evening, the fever broke. Abigail sat up, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching Jedediah silently whittle a piece of cedar by the fire. The storm outside had passed, leaving a profound, suffocating silence in its wake. "Why did you do it?" Abigail finally asked, her voice steady in the quiet room. "You don't know me. You made an enemy of the most dangerous man in the territory. Why?" Jedediah paused his knife. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. I watched men like Thaddeus Cornwall build empires out in Kansas. I watched them use the law as a club to beat down anyone who stood in their way. I swore I'd never watch it happen again. Abigail pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. They called you the Bear. Cornwall seemed to recognize you. Who were you before you came up here? A fool, Jedediah answered bluntly, finally turning his gray eyes to meet hers. A federal marshal in Abilene who thought a tin star meant something. I lost good men trying to enforce a law that the rich had already bought and paid for. I came to these mountains to forget the world below. And I brought the world right to your doorstep, Abigail said softly, guilt pooling in her stomach. Cornwall won't let this go, Mr. Callahan. He wanted me for his own vile purposes. And when I refused him, he framed me for the bank robbery. He owns the sheriff, the judge, and the town. He will send men up this mountain. Let him, Jedediah said, his voice void of any fear, holding only a cold, deadly promise. This is my mountain, Miss Prescott. Down there, his money makes him a king. Up here, he's just meat. Over the next 3 weeks, a strange, quiet domesticity settled over the cabin. As Abigail's wounds healed, she refused to be a burden. She took over the cooking, mended his worn buckskins, and learned to clean and dress the game he brought home. In return, Jedediah taught her how to shoot his heavy Colt revolver, his massive hands patiently guiding hers, correcting her stance. The physical proximity, the accidental brushing of hands, and the shared, silent evenings by the fire ignited a slow, burning tension between them. Abigail found herself studying the rugged lines of his face, the raw strength in his shoulders, and the hidden kindness in his gruff demeanor. Jedediah, in turn, found his solitary world irrevocably altered. He listened for her breathing at night. He looked for her face at the window when he returned from checking his trap lines. The mountain man had led a woman into his fortress, and he realized, with a quiet, terrifying certainty, that he would burn the world to ash before he let anyone take her away. The peace of the high country shattered on a freezing Tuesday morning. Jedediah was chopping firewood. Inside, Abigail was kneading dough, humming softly. Suddenly, chaotic cries of jays erupted from the southern tree line. Jedediah stopped his swing. He lowered his axe, listening. The forest had gone dead silent. No squirrels chattered. No wind rustled the boughs. It was the silence of a predator. He sprinted for the cabin. Bursting through the heavy oak door, he grabbed his Winchester rifle and tossed Abigail the loaded Colt revolver. "Get away from the windows," Jedediah ordered, his voice laced with iron urgency. "Stay behind the stone hearth." "Cornwall?" Abigail asked, gripping the heavy pistol and ducking behind the massive chimney stones. "Bounty hunters," Jedediah grunted, peering through a small chink in the log walls. 5 of them, armed with repeating rifles. Cornwall paid for professionals. Leading the men through the snowdrifts was Gideon Croft, a notorious Denver tracker. Croft stepped out from behind a massive pine, a repeating rifle leveled at the door. "Jedediah Callahan," Croft shouted with a nasal twang. "We got a warrant from Mayor Cornwall for the immediate return of Abigail Prescott. Send the girl out, and we can leave you to freeze in peace." Jedediah did not answer. He racked the lever of his Winchester, the metallic clack incredibly loud. He looked back at Abigail. She nodded once. "Callahan," Croft yelled. "I brought dynamite. We will blow this shack to splinters." Jedediah kicked the heavy wooden door open, raising the rifle. He fired. The slug caught the man next to Croft in the chest, throwing him backward. The mountain's silence was shredded by answering gunfire. Splinters exploded into the cabin as bullets tore through the logs. Jedediah dropped to one knee, firing twice more, hitting a second man before ducking back inside from the hail of lead. "They are flanking!" Jedediah shouted. He shattered the side window glass with his rifle butt to create a firing port. Abigail did not stay hidden. The thought of returning to Cornwall and his grip banished her fear. She crawled to the opposite window, resting the Colt on the windowsill. A man in a thick coat was sprinting toward the cabin, a lit stick of dynamite in his hand. "Deep breath," Squeeze. Abigail fired. The bullet hit the man in the thigh. He screamed, dropping the dynamite into the snow. The explosive detonated with a thunderous roar, burying the screaming man in a geyser of snow. "3 down," Jedediah called out with a fierce grin. "Good shooting, Miss Prescott." Outside, Croft realized his terrible mistake. Pinned behind a rock, he saw 3 of his men down and panicked. He broke cover and ran frantically for the horses tied down the trail. Jedediah stepped onto the porch. He tracked Croft through the iron sights and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck the dirt an inch from the boot, sending the bounty hunter sprawling into the mud. Croft threw his hands up, screaming for mercy. Jedediah walked down the steps. Abigail followed closely, the revolver still gripped tightly in her hand. They approached the trembling bounty hunter. "Please," Croft begged. "Cornwall paid us $1,000. Just let me go." Jedediah stood over him. "You ride back to Oakhaven," he said. "Tell Thaddeus Cornwall that Abigail Prescott is dead to the world. But tell him this, too. If another armed man sets foot on this mountain, I will come down, and I will hang Thaddeus Cornwall from the balcony of his own bank. Understand?" "Yes!" Croft scrambled to his feet, bolting for his horse and riding down the mountain. Jedediah watched him go until he vanished into the timberline. The siege was over. The mountain was quiet once more. Jedediah turned to